Okay, so we are now live on Facebook as well. Rochelle is joining us. Welcome, Rochelle. This is Shelley Haynes with the St. Joseph Museums. I am here this afternoon with author Julie Nicolai, who has written the book Enslavement and the Underground Railroad in Missouri and Illinois. She is going to be giving us a presentation this afternoon. We ask that you keep everything on mute, and if you have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll look at it towards the end. So with that, I'd like to welcome Julie. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. I am going to talk about my book, Enslavement and the Underground Railroad in Missouri and Illinois, which was released on July 31 of this year. Okay, now I cannot advance my slides. Maybe if I do it that way. Okay, I just have to use a different way. Okay, this whole project was inspired by living across the street as a kid from this structure, the Old De Pere Presbyterian Church. And this would be in St. Louis County. And it was built by enslavers in 1833, 1834. That area also had German abolitionists that came in the 1830s, and even French remnants, as St. Louis was, of course, started in 1764 under three flags, French, Spanish, and then American. And this little church was in a very divided area. When the enslavers started this church, they set aside an area in the little cemetery where their enslaved would be buried unmarked. And then later on, the parent church, Faith de Pere, in the 1980s, put a big boulder with a plaque on it in the spot where the enslaved peoples are buried. But in the 1970s, when I was a little kid in elementary school, my dad would take me over here and talk to the conservation architects that were rehabbing this little church. And they actually put me down in the hiding place underneath the floorboards, which was big enough for about 2 to 3 people to be sardined into for a few hours till they moved them on. And it had the rough brick walls and the rough limestone and dirt floor. They also had excavated a tunnel entrance, but they didn't go into the tunnel to see where it went. And then unfortunately, all that was destroyed when they put a sub-basement in for the HVAC system. So none of that is there anymore. But that is the original walls of the church, the stone walls. And also, Elijah Lovejoy, the famous abolitionist and free press martyr, that was one of the impetuses for the Civil War, was commissioned as a minister here at this little church. And that's primarily documented in the Presbyterian session records. So this little church is a hugely historic church. And I was probably the last person to be inside the actual hiding place. This was housed a German congregation in the mid-1830s. They probably were the ones that were doing the Underground Railroad activity here. So reasons for writing my book. I interviewed many people, well over 100, and I want to preserve these oral traditions. When you're talking about the Underground Railroad, it was a covert network to allow escaped slaves, which we properly now call freedom seekers, move to freedom in the northern United States, Canada, Caribbean, western United States, depending on where they were enslaved. And so we do not have a lot of primary documentation for these activities. There are some for the individual sites. So we rely on these long oral traditions going back into the 19th century, and also court records and contemporary newspaper articles narratives of Underground Railroad conductors and that sort of thing are also primary documentation concerning it. So I also wanted to look at where these enslaved people lived and where they died and how they actually, some of them obtained their freedom. So it's divided into 3 sections, the Underground Railroad sites, the burial of enslaved people sites, and the dwellings of enslaved people sites. There's no book on the Underground Railroad in Missouri. There are in Illinois, but not Missouri. I wanted to document never before published sites for posterity. And finally, foster a better understanding of a history often forgotten. And I was very fortunate because my publisher did allow me to put over 50 illustrations in my book, and that was huge for me. I really wanted to have a lot of illustrations, so that was great. And they turned it over in about 9 months, which was very, very fast. I wanted to talk about 3 case studies, and then I'll get into some individual sites. So one of these is a yes, one's a maybe, and one is a no. And this is just to show you how I went about going to these sites and documenting them photographically and pulling up the records and that sort of thing. So this is 3170 Fifi Road in Florissant, which is a suburb in North St. Louis County. And the main part of the house, the 2-story central part of the house, was built in the 1840s. And then that little tiny brick addition in the back was the 1920s. And there is a 2-story log structure with gun ports embedded in the 1840s section of this house that was dated by a scientist to the 1790 to 1820 period. So I had driven past this house many, many times, and I always wondered about it. So finally, it was a private residence. So finally, it went up for sale. And so my friend Jean Curl, a local historian, and I, the realtor was kind enough to give us all the documentation she had on this house and let us go through the whole house and even into the basement. So it turns out that the log building with the gun ports was what they called Mackay's Fort. So in the St. Charles County area, down in the Defiance, Missouri area, there were a series of these little wooden structures. They were pretty rudimentary, but they were called forts. So the settlers could go in these little forts if there was going to be a First Nations attack for protection. So we think that this log structure was one of those originally on this site. And then later on, the brick house was built around it in the 1840s. Jean was able to find a deed tracing this back to James Mackay, and he actually explored west, not all the way to the Pacific Ocean, but far into the western interior, and made maps. And Lewis and Clark actually used his map on their later famous expeditions to the Pacific Ocean. And he was also commandant of St. Ferdinand, which is now Florissant today. So he was having communications with this was the Spanish regime at this point. So he was having all kinds of communication with the Spanish officials in New Orleans and the Spanish officials even in Europe. And so we actually have all of his correspondence, and I was able to read copies of all of it. And it's really amazing. Very, very interesting stuff. So anyway, moving on to the 1840s, both enslavers and abolitionists lived in this house. So we had both living at different times in this home. Sorry, excuse me. So this is the basement. It was pitch black when I went in it. So I was just using my phone to light it up. So you can see that stone wall kind of in the middle center, and there's a projection coming out that was 20th century to hide the tunnel entrance. And then to the left, you can see the fireplace, and that fireplace goes all the way up to the second floor. And so this is the main floor fireplace, and usually, typically, the fireplace will project out from the outer wall, and then the opening of the fireplace will be flush with the interior wall. Well, you can see this juts, several feet, 4 feet into the actual living space. And this is a typical structure of false fireplaces. There's actually an extant one in a home up in Quincy, Illinois. And it's very similar to this. You can actually still go inside that one and see the hiding place. And then outside, there is a normal old well with the shaft and the equipment to lift the bucket and that sort of thing. It has a little well house around it. And then about 300 feet away is this. So, we took the boards off and found this, and you can see the very old brick, and then someone concreted over that later on, but you can see the original brick behind the concrete. And so there's just a big old underground lake here. It's full of water almost up to the opening. There's no shaft. And then there's these very old stone pads along the east side of the house that look like air holes. And so what, in the mid 20th century, there was a newspaper article with the owners of this house, and they actually had pictures of the tunnel, and kids had gone in there, but they couldn't go all the way to the end because it was too dangerous. So I'm almost positive, although I cannot actually document this, but just from my exploration, I'm pretty positive that that false fireplace was used to hide the freedom seekers, and then that tunnel out of the basement would have gone along and these holes along the side of the house were also full of water. So we know there's this huge space. There's like a big tunnel area. And so they would have gone along that tunnel. Maybe these were air holes. They used, who knows, they dropped food down there. They could have been put down that false well in an emergency situation. And then there's a large creek behind this house that when it's high water, you could put a skiff on there and get to the main river. So this one is a yes, and I'm really glad that I was able to photo document this because it was demolished, and now there's just a housing development, a brand new housing development there. Jean and I saved the log portion, so it is now in storage, and it's going to be reassembled in a park in Florissant. So we were really proud of our work on this one. So this one is a maybe. This is in Alton, Illinois. This is the Christian Serenity House, and that's wrong. It's actually in Elsa, Illinois. I apologize. That slide is wrong. It's Elsa, Illinois. So the stone part of that house, the first floor, was pre-Civil War, and then they put a probably late 19th century mansard roof on there, and then that little white protruding portion in the back is probably 20th century. So I went to Elsa because I had heard about all this Underground Railroad oral tradition there. And of course, you just cross the river from Missouri, a slave state, and you're over in Illinois, a free area. So I went in here, and there was a very elderly lady, probably in her 90s, that ran a little foundation for Elsa out of this little building. So she's like, yeah, there's a hiding place back there. Just go knock on the door of the little white thing, it was down on the bottom floor of that little white back addition. And so I went and knocked on the door, and a really nice young man that went to Principia College up on the hill opened the door, and he let me go in. He's just like, yeah, come on in. And he lifted his floor covering, and there was a trapdoor to a hiding place, and very similar to the old DePere hiding place with the rough limestone brick walls and the dirt floor, a little bit bigger, but very, very old. And at the time it was put there, it was obviously the newer addition wasn't there, and it was outside the footprint of the main house. So it very well could have been accessed through the basement of that structure, or there could have been a door hidden by an outbuilding. But I found no documentation on this house, but I'm going to say a maybe on this because I can't imagine what else it would have been, because being outside the footprint of the house is always sort of a red flag. Yeah, this was Underground Railroad, because it would have been hidden. This is the Bean Tree Cafe in Waterloo, Illinois. So me and my friend who goes on adventures with me were just starting out, and we were just driving through here, and we just wanted to get breakfast. So we literally just stopped here to eat. But as it turned out, I went in and we're like, oh, we could tell it was really old. Is there any, Underground Railroad history around here? And she's like, well, I don't know, but you can just look through the whole house. Just go down in the basement. We don't care. So, this building goes back to the early 19th century, 1820s or 30s. It was originally part of a Spanish land grant. And so we went down in the basement. There are all these weird cubby holes in the walls, and covered up places in the brick walls and that sort of thing. But that could have just been due to alterations over the years. I found no documentation or oral traditions in this structure, so this is a no. This is actually what they call the Enos Apartments now. And it was originally the Nathaniel Hansen House, and it was built in the 1850s by Hansen. It is documented in his memoirs, his Underground Railroad activities. So this would be considered a documented site. So this is the hiding place off the basement of this home. He built this as an Underground Railroad station with 18-inch thick basement walls. There was a large cupola on top of the house so they could signal the river down the hill. And so you can see that it has the dirt limestone floor, the lower limestone walls, and then the upper arched brick walls and ceiling. This is absolutely unaltered since when it was built, except for the pipes and the light. Otherwise, this is what it would have looked like back then. So this extends outside the footprint of the house underneath 3rd Street. And the door to this room would be on the basement wall, and then this would project out into the yard and under the street. So it's outside the footprint of the home, so no one would know it was there. So you'd put something over the door to this room to hide it. And then the other side of the basement actually has a tunnel, and I've been in it. It's there for sure. And the tunnel goes to the detached carriage house. So what was happening is they would come across the river from Missouri, and then they would be signaled from the cupola here, whether it was clear or not, and then brought in a false bottomed wagon up to the carriage house. Then they could go in the tunnel to the basement and then into this room to be hidden. And then this room was later used as a coal bin, so you can still see all the soot in this room. But also I have been told that there was a tunnel from the carriage house down to the river area, and when they were excavating a surface parking lot below this house, they actually found part of that tunnel. I have not actually personally seen that, though. So I also just want to talk about some of the other sites besides Underground Railroad that I documented. So this is Black Walnut Cemetery in Black Walnut, Missouri. So I know you guys are in the Kansas City area, so this would be like St. Charles County, like north of the city of St. Charles. So this little cemetery contains the grave of Burl Jefferson, an enslaved man and resident of Callaway County. Doris Keevan Franke, a local author and historian, believes there's an unmarked section of enslaved burials in this cemetery. She found like their field stones that were laid out in a pattern in their own section, unmarked. So that would be typical of enslaved burial area. when I visited, it was quite a while ago, so it had just been like all overgrown and everything. Then when I visited, they had started to put these grave markers back where they thought they had been. And now it's gorgeous. They're all back in their original spots. Everything's mowed. There's signage. It looks fantastic. So kudos to the local residents who went and fixed this cemetery up. And this is Kimmswick Cemetery in Kimmswick, Missouri, which is kind of between St. Louis and St. Genevieve on the Mississippi. So the lower part of this cemetery, closest to the highway, which would be in the background, contains burials of enslaved people that were originally surrounded by cowrie shells, which is a traditional African way of marking a grave. Of course, those are now gone and they're unmarked. I want to spend a little time on this church because it's absolutely amazing, one of a kind. This is Brazo Presbyterian Church from the early 1850s. So this is in Perry County, Missouri, about 15 miles west of the Mississippi River. You can see that architecturally, it's very cool. Normally, tie rods go between the ceiling of one floor and the floorboards of the floor above it, and they're hidden. And then there's the anchoring pins on the outside of the wall to hold the walls together. So this actually has exposed tie rods, and I've seen very few buildings with exposed tie rods. So that was very cool. So this church actually has a slave balcony. You can see that goes around three sides. It also goes like where I'm standing. And so the enslaved people would have been forced to sit up in this segregated balcony, and they called them slave galleries. So, and there are enslavers buried in this cemetery as well, which goes back to like 1832 before this building was built. But up on the railings and the post of the slave gallery are all these carvings. And so I took the curator of the Missouri History Museum with me down here. And so we think, although we can't find primary documentation, we did ask the local historian, and the enslaved people probably would have had a rudimentary ability to write letters and simple words and numbers. They would have been taught that. And so it's sort of like a little pocket of enslavement in a larger abolitionist area. So we think that these early carvings were probably done by the enslaved people pre-1860, late 1865. Then after emancipation, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, maybe they still sat up here as free blacks. Maybe, maybe the kids sat up here. Maybe it was just used for anybody who wanted to sit in a balcony. So the later carvings may have been done by some of those people, because we see very rudimentary lettering and numbering, and then we see actual ones in different fancy scripts. So you can see like 1865 September in a rudimentary script in this slide. I don't think the RHB, it looks like that's in a different hand, but that 1865 September, obviously that's when the 13th Amendment was passed, abolishing slavery that year. So perhaps this was one of those newly freed people commemorating that with a carving in the railing here. This is actually a diagram. Hattie said that perhaps was a diagram of the church itself, or a barn or something like that. So you can see under the floor, there's a square with an X. So perhaps denoting a hidden room. Is this Underground Railroad code? Also, I know someone who had researched Vodun, or voodoo symbolism, and said this was similar to some of the Damballa symbolism, that vive of the Vodun. So I'm further researching this to see if I can figure out what this is, because I think it's highly important and it's very extremely rare. So it's also, I've got it up with the curator of the Detroit Art Museum because he is an expert in African symbology. So hopefully we can find out more about this one. This is the Powell House in St. Charles. The Ludwell Powell House in St. Charles. So it was built about 1840. Colonel Powell was the first mayor of St. Charles. He was an enslaver, and the original brick slave quarters were behind this house. And Doris Keevan Franke had found a tunnel underneath this that went to this little Madison Street church, sort of catty corner on the street running perpendicular to that one. And so it's thought that the enslaved of Powell used the tunnel for protection to get to church services, because at that time it was illegal to educate Blacks in Missouri. And also the enslavers didn't like their enslaved going to church either. So it's thought that that tunnel was actually used more for protection. It wouldn't have been Underground Railroad. And this little church is a historic African Methodist Episcopal church built by enslaved people about 1855. And in 1947, it was renovated into a residence. And you can see a part of the little brick house to the right of it was the home of Absalom White, a former enslaved person. After being freed, he was lynched for preaching the gospel. Workers found his freedom papers hidden under the stairs of this home. And I just wanted to, we know about, like, in the St. Louis area, the lynchings of Francis McIntosh and John Buckner, but nobody really ever talks about this one. So I just wanted to read an account of this lynching to give you an idea. This is 1854. Mr. White, a minister of the gospel, was observed by a couple of secession spies talking with two Negroes on the road within 5 miles of St. Charles County, Missouri. They rushed up and seized him, bound him hand and foot. Then, taking him to an old stump of a tree, they produced a rope with a slip knot on it, and after tying one end of it to the tree, placed a barrel under Mr. White's feet and slipped the noose over his head. Mr. White here confessed that he had tried to get the Negroes to run away. After he had said a prayer, the barrel was kicked from under him and he was left dangling between heaven and earth. Mr. White was always regarded by the people in the neighborhood as an abolitionist and had often been warned to leave. This is the U.S. Grant National Historic Site, or Whitehaven, in St. Louis County. And it has a extensive history of enslavement here. Some of this information comes from Nick Sacco, who's a park ranger. They also had a great exhibit on slavery, but a lot of this is actually my original research as well. So every owner of this property until 1865 was an enslaver. William Lindsay Long lived there from 1808 to 1818, and his enslaved built portions of the Whitehaven home. Theodore and Ann Lucas Hunt bought this property from Long in 1818. There were several log cabins there that were slave dwellings. Hunt himself enslaved 5 people: Wallace, Andrew, Lydia, Lutet, and Addie. I always like to name the enslaved people because it's something that we should always do. We're naming all these famous people. We need to name the enslaved as well. And so oftentimes in the slave schedules and inventories, they're not listed by name. They're just listed by age or skin color, gender. So we do have names for most of the enslaved here. Frederick Dent, the father of Julia, Ulysses' wife, lived there from 1820 to 65 and expanded the property to 850 acres. Per the slave schedules, Dent owned 30 slaves in 1850. And Grant himself did enslave one person, William Jones, who was given to him by Dent. Grant did free Jones in 1859. Dent gifted 4 of his enslaved people to Julia, Ulysses' wife, Dan, Eliza, John, and a different Julia. Mary Robinson was an enslaved cook here. Old Bob traveled with the Dents from the East Coast to St. Louis and cut wood for the Whitehaven fireplaces. And Nick had pointed out an 1829 black oak tree that still stands on this property. And I'm sure that old Bob would have been out there by that tree cutting the firewood. Andy Hahn, director of the Campbell House Museum, found an 1858 record indicating that Grant hired out George, an enslaved of Francis Sublet, who worked at Whitehaven in 1858. Then around 1864, the enslaved at Whitehaven liberated themselves. And we really don't know how they did this, if they just left. It was only a year before the 13th Amendment, and we don't really have much of a record of any of them after they liberated themselves. According to Emmett Casey's memoir, there were 18 simple log cabins on the northern part of this property that served as dwellings for the enslaved there. In 1871, while serving as president of the U.S., Grant asked Whitehaven's caretaker to tear down these slave dwellings. And I just want to name these people: Jewel, Old Bob, Jim, Charles, Sue Ann, Hester, Jeff, Willis, Dan, Henrietta Jones, Mary Robinson, William Jones, Aunt Edie, Kitty, and Rose. And this slide is a rudimentary door on the back of the Whitehaven house that the enslaved people were forced to use to enter and exit the home. And one other interesting thing is they actually, during archaeological work here, there's a winter kitchen here, which is in the basement of the main house where the enslaved people would have cooked. And they actually found fragments of slate. And I mean, this space would have been for enslaved people. There wouldn't have been white people using this space. So they think maybe that they were teaching themselves to read and write down there with slate boards and pencils. And this is the outbuilding, one of the outbuildings at Whitehaven that was used as a laundry building or summer kitchen. And then this is the upper part that would have been used for the enslaved working in that building to live in. And this is just the general area where the cabins of the enslaved would have been located, but they're long gone. This is actually Oakdale Cemetery in Illinois, inside of Oakdale Presbyterian Church. So the church would have been in that empty space by the trees. And it does contain burials of people associated with the Underground Railroad. And the site of Reverend Andrew Todd's house is nearby. He was an Underground Railroad activist and pastor of the church. Other Oakdale conductors included John Carson, Cyrus McClurkin, and John Torrance, who were drivers, John B. and Donaldson, and they all lived on farms around the cemetery. This is John Hood's overturned grave in Oakdale Cemetery. And his home is actually on the back cover of my book. And he built that home in 1843. He was a Covenanter, a Presbyterian movement opposed to slavery that was very active in Underground Railroad activities in central Illinois. And this home was on the Underground Railroad route starting in Chester and going northeast through Randolph, Washington, and Marion counties. And just quickly, in Illinois, the Covenanters and the Congregationalists were the two most active religions on the Underground Railroad in that state. This is Dennis Hollow Cemetery, and I love this picture, and cemetery is actually misspelled, which makes it even quainter. But it's also was known as Black Cemetery or Old Valmeyer Cemetery. The oldest death date I could find was 1853. An African-American man lived in the hollow just down the road at the base of the bluff. and an African-American community developed in that area. So this was their cemetery. And that's just a picture of the cemetery. It's up on a hill, fortunately. So in the disastrous 1993 floods that took out so much of Valmeyer, the cemetery was actually saved. So, sorry, Henry Clay Work was the son of Allenson Work, who was active on the Underground Railroad and had moved from the East Coast to Illinois as an Underground Railroad activist. He was associated with the 4 mission institutes in Quincy, Illinois. Number 2, or Theophilus, was a manual labor institute founded by Underground Railroad conductors Dr. David Nelson. His house is the one that had the false fireplace hiding place. And Dr. Richard Els in 1836. You can actually go in the Els house now. It was thought that he actually was just organizing Underground Railroad groups and stops, but they recently did find a hiding place inside that house. So now scholarship has been changed to reflect that he was actually hiding people in that house. So this Mission Institute number 2 was run by Reverend Moses Hunter. The Benjamin Terrell house on the property served as a 4-room dorm and hiding place for freedom seekers, hidden between the 2nd-story floor and 1st-story ceiling, and in a secret room in the basement, accessible only through a trap door. In 1841, 3 students from this Mission Institute, Allenson Work, James Burr, and George Thompson, were caught assisting freedom seekers by Missouri authorities. They were convicted in several years and spent several years in prison at the Missouri State Pen in Jeff City. So this is Ebenezer Hollow Church near Rockwood, Illinois. Dr. William Vance gave medical assistance to freedom seekers. The local women fed and clothed them, and they were taken through Ebenezer Hollow to the area of a cave and hide tannery, which served as cover for Underground Railroad work. And then from there, they went to the Burlingame House in Eden, Illinois, which is in my book. So Underground Railroad activity started in this area before 1850, and an abolitionist group was formed around that year in Rockwood, headed by Ezekiel Barber, who met freedom seekers and gave them food, and then took them to William Harry's house where they were hidden in the cellar. First Presbyterian Church in Rockwood and Ebenezer Presbyterian Church near Rockwood were also involved in these activities. Route 3 crosses the Marys River near Rockwood, and the river was followed by freedom seekers from where it begins at the Mississippi just below Chester, Illinois, an Underground Railroad hub, almost all the way to Chicago. From Chester, freedom seekers went along the Marys River to the Eden-Sparta area. The graves of descendants of James Clendenin, an area Underground Railroad conductor, are in the cemetery of this little church you see in the slide. Clendenin had arrived in Chester in 1837. He used a cave on his farm as a hiding place. And right across the river from this Rockwood area was Allen's farm, and Allen was an enslaver. It was referred to as Allen's Landing. A trade network existed between this landing and the merchants of Rockwood. George, one of Allen's enslaved, was allowed to take goods across the river, and he used this as a cover to transport freedom seekers to the Rockwood area. These are just some really old steps in a foundation of a home that I liked. I don't know actually what this is. I just like the photo. Salem Baptist Church in Wood Station, Illinois. Now this area is home to a section of the Aryan Nation. It's very active there right now. This congregation was organized in 1819, and its original church was at the Little McCoy Family Cemetery. The current church, the third one, was built in 1912, which is this one. Some enslaved people by the name of Stewart were buried in the McCoy Family Cemetery, but were later moved to the Salem Baptist Church Cemetery in 1903. The little McCoy family cemetery is still there off a rural road and hidden by a grove of trees with ancient yucca plants guarding the graves. They're still there. I mean, it's so overgrown now, you can hardly even see any of the stones in there. But the church is in the middle of an underground railroad hub, could certainly have been involved in the activities. James and Matilda Bollinger were free blacks from Wood Station. They are buried in the Salem Baptist Church Cemetery. That would be the one here. The free blacks in Wood Station, including the Johnsons and Bollingers, helped absorb freedom seekers into the community or assisted them onto the next station. And I should point out quickly that there were many, many free black communities throughout Illinois that went back to the 1820s. And they did help freedom seekers. And in general, in Missouri and Illinois area, most of the Underground Railroad activists were free blacks, not abolitionist whites, although they did help as well. Well, this is actually in your area. So this is the Bingham Wagner Estate in Independence from 1852. So it was built with bricks handmade by John Lewis's enslaved people. So it's thought that the outbuilding in the black and white photograph on the right part of the photograph behind the trees was a dwelling for the enslaved people. And the famous American painter George Caleb Bingham lived in the main larger house on the left during the Civil War and used that little outbuilding as a studio where he painted his controversial Order Number 11. And then the color photos just today, it's the outbuilding is gone. So that's just a contemporary photo. So I'm going to close out by just quickly showing you 3 really amazing cemeteries that they're probably my 3 favorite cemeteries that I've been to, and I've been to hundreds, believe me. So this is Buster Cemetery in Valleys Mines, Missouri. That area is very, very old, and lots of early French families in that area connected to St. Louis and St. Genevieve. This is an African-American cemetery. The earliest death date I could find was 1837, although the majority of death dates are late 19th and 20th century. And this is just a really simple iron cross marker. And then some of these African Americans buried here just did not have the resources to have headstones made for them. So they would just take a slab and take a hammer and chisel and carve their own. And this is an example of one of those. There are just rough, uninscribed limestone markers randomly throughout this cemetery. This was probably like a 5-foot tall cross, and on the back of it were embedded these cowrie shells, which were a traditional way of marking African American graves. And I mean, this cemetery is just a microcosm of the different ways African Americans have memorialized their loved ones over time. Old St. Joachim Cemetery in Old Mines, Missouri. Just a gorgeous cemetery, really beautiful. The earliest death date I found was 1835. It contains just tons of these very old French style iron cross markers, which are very haunting when you photograph them. It had a couple of like above ground New Orleans style graves. These would have been white people. And in all these old cemeteries, there's sunken graves. They're just so old, they eventually sink in. There were several of these, like these are like markers where they just put these different size stones on the marker. And I researched this and I could not find anything on this. I don't know if it was just a family who liked this or what it was, but I just thought they were interesting. And just like a scenic view, you can actually see the tiny little church steeple in the background. And so many of the graves here are deteriorating. Like, I would never do this, but I could literally have just opened that up or stuck my hand inside the grave if I wanted to. And then finally, I'll wrap up with St. Anne Cemetery in French Village, Missouri, established in 1828. So roving missionaries offered religious services to the local residents before St. Anne's Parish was established in 1828. The present church was built in 1871 and rebuilt after a 1919 fire. And that's that church. And then you can see these are old French families, old white French families, and you can see how much more ornate their iron cross markers are than the ones in the African American Cemetery Buster. So George Washington Brooks and his wife Martha were formerly enslaved people by Salim Grandjean, and they're buried here. A cabin used as quarters for the enslaved people of Grandjean has been moved from its original location on the farm of Vouillet to the yard of the general store at Valley's Mines. So there's all these historic buildings at the old Valley Mines. And so they moved that slave dwelling to there, and it still stands there. You can see it. So Salim Grandjean inherited this whole property from Vouillet, and he later converted the cabin into a granary. There were 5 dwellings for the enslaved on the original farm site, 440 acres located at the far eastern end of Valley's Mines. The Brookses lived on the 2nd floor of the main brick house. And Grandjean was married to Emily Aubuchon of a well-known area family. So this is one of the Aubuchon markers, and it's just interesting because this one's the Aubuchon is 2 words, AU and then Bouchon, but then later on it just became 1 word. So it's kind of neat how this grave reflects the old way of spelling Aubuchon. And I thank you all very much for coming to my talk today.
Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you for your research. You've done a really nice job putting together information about the older buildings, the people, and the cemeteries throughout these 2 states that people would need to know about. They need to be recognized. We do carry Julie's book in the gift shop at the St. Joseph Museums. This presentation is on our St. Joseph Museum Facebook page. And later this week, we'll go on to our YouTube channel. So it will be there forever if anybody wants to look at it. Does anybody have any comments or questions they'd like to drop in the chat before we let Julie go? Sherlon Pulliam says, great job.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, looks like that's it. Thank you so much, Julie. We really do appreciate you taking your time to spend with us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it, and thank everyone for coming.
Absolutely. You take care, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.